Proclaiming Christ, victor over sin and death. You're listening to Ancient Faith Radio, your Orthodox Internet radio connection.
Welcome to Live with the Louhs with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us on this Tuesday, December 12th. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your schedules to just take a moment to be with us. Roxanne's unable to be with us this evening, but I do want to encourage you that if this is the first time that you're listening to Live with the Louhs, you should know that it is a show that merges both faith and psychology to kind of give you some practical steps to apply in your own walk of faith. So once again, thanks for joining us this evening. Before we get into really tonight's important topic, I do, as I always share every single week, I just invite you to stay connected to us all throughout the week on our social media platforms. Friends, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on YouTube and Twitter, all under the headings of the Louhs, and that last name is spelled Louhs. And we're also, in fact, all of our sermons and our shows are archived on our Louhs our Louhs YouTube channel. So definitely check that out and subscribe if you haven't already. And also, if you're interested in receiving one of our daily inspirational messages, in fact, every single day at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, we write and then send out an email to just a whole bunch of people that kind of just does a lot of what we talk about in our show. It covers different topics, but gives you just a little daily devotional. And if you're one of these people that would need a little daily devotional, a little word of encouragement, take advantage of this. You can go to our website at thelouhs.com. That's Louhs.com. Click on that subscribe button and simply just put in your email address, and every single day at 7 a.m., you'll receive that day's daily inspirational message. And as always, we love to hear from you during the live broadcast of our show, so feel free to communicate with us. You can do it a number of ways. One is through the Ancient Faith YouTube channel, which is broadcasting this show. You can leave a comment there or a question, and our producer will definitely get that to us, as well as you can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or feel free to email me during the live broadcast of our show by emailing me at ask, that's A-S-K, at ancientfaith.com. So let's get started. Friends, one of the greatest fears that we all can experience at times is the fear of suffering. It's easy to talk about how great our faith is when we're on the mountaintop and we don't have any worries or stresses in this world. But I would argue that we get to know God when we're crawling through the valley of suffering. In fact, in the Divine Liturgy, it says a Christian end to our life that is without pain and suffering. But so often in this world that we live in right now, people tend to want to avoid this notion of suffering. In fact, many Christian churches try to avoid this idea of suffering. But what is suffering, and how important it is in our walk of faith? We've invited a new friend of our show that is going to be just a fantastic guest, and we're so excited that you're all with us to hear him. It's Dr. Daniel Hinshaw. Let me tell you a little bit about him and why we felt him to be the guest on this specific topic. Dr. Daniel Hinshaw is a professor emeritus of surgery and a consultant in palliative medicine at the University of Michigan. He has taught palliative care to medical professionals and clergy in multiple international settings. In fact, in addition to many of the scientific articles and chapters, he's also the author of several books, some of which are Suffering and the Nature of Healing, that was published in 2013, Touch and the Healing of the World in 2017, Thriving in the Face of Mortality, Kenosis and the Mystery of Life in 2023, and then a historical novel, Neither Bond Nor Free. And the forthcoming book coming soon is Journey to Simplicity, The Life and Wisdom of Archimandrite Roman Braga. Dr. Hinshaw, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on Live with the Louhs.
Oh, thank you for having me, Father Nick. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, it's a blessing to have you with us as well. So let me, this topic of suffering, I know we were talking offline about this, but, tell us about this suffering and why that was such a topic that you spent so much time writing about and researching and studying about.
Well, I think it's hard to separate the journey, my professional journey, from my spiritual journey that my wife and I both made toward the Orthodox Church. We were canonically received into the church in middle of the 1990s, 1995, at Pentecost. But we had been, catechumens and inquirers for several years before that. And at the time that we were entering the church, I was, for some inexplicably foolish reasons, as a young attending physician, doing a fair amount of hospital administration. So I was seeing a lot of suffering at our Veterans Hospital, which is affiliated with the University of Michigan. I'd been the chief of surgery there, and then at the time we became Orthodox, I was serving as the acting and then regular chief of the medical services, so the chief of staff. And leading up to that time, my wife, who is a psychiatrist, had been the liaison psychiatrist to the hospital's AIDS clinic. And if you remember, in the early 1990s, it was a death sentence. So these were young men who had lived pretty wild lives and now were suffering and were facing their death. And it was an extraordinary thing for her to witness certainly their anguish, their psychological distress, but at the same time, many of them underwent profound and kind of transformative changes as people. They acquired a depth and understanding of questions that they might never have addressed if they weren't facing death.
Right.
And in fact, it's a wonderful thing that antiretroviral drugs have been developed.
Right.
But a lot of that sort of acute encounter with one's mortality has been put off in the HIV population. So you don't see quite as many of those extraordinary, rapid internal growth that occurred during that early phase. And but that was, I think, probably a trigger for me to really begin to think about my own background as a surgeon. Surgeons are trained to focus on disease, to cure it, if possible, by surgical interventions or other treatments. And that's been and still remains largely the focus of modern medicine, especially in the West, is identifying diseases and treating them aggressively with medication or with surgical or other procedural interventions. And that's all very good. And there's been an enormous amount of benefit to people from that kind of revolution that occurred over the last century in the medical sciences. But by the same token, there's another thing that perhaps has been lost, or at least been buried a little bit, and that is a sense of what does it mean to be healed as opposed to being cured. And I think that this is wrapped up in this issue of suffering. And when I saw, as a hospital administrator and also as a new Orthodox, the convergence of my witnessing a lot of suffering in the hospital that we couldn't fix, the things that are not, all of my patients, all of our patients in hospitals, in fact, all of us, those on the, that are listening in, and the two of us on this podcast are going to die. I mean, this is a part of our nature. We're mortal creatures as a result of the fall, and how do we respond to that? And so one of the extraordinary things I think about the Orthodox encounter coming at this moment in our professional lives for my wife and for me was to realize that there's this other aspect of healing that is inextricably linked to suffering. And it seems paradoxical, but as you made in your initial remarks, you said that there is a connection between suffering and coming closer to God. And this is the maybe perhaps one of the most profound quotes I can make that I became aware of fairly early in my Orthodox journey, and just sort of took my breath away when I saw it the first time, was a statement by Saint Ignatius of Antioch, very early saint of the Church, who on his way to Rome to be martyred in the Colosseum, eaten by lions, multiple Orthodox Christians of the time were trying to intervene on his behalf to save him, and he said, "Don't do this." And then he gave an explanation, and I will just quote this from his letter to the Smyrnians. "And why have I given myself up to death, to fire, to the sword, to wild beasts? Because near the sword is near to God. And with the wild beasts is with God. In the name of Jesus Christ alone am I enduring all things, that I may suffer with him, and the perfect man himself gives me strength." And so this is this extraordinary thing that we sometimes, if we sort of stop and pause, for those who are listening, who are working as physicians, as nurses, other kinds of health professionals, or who are just maybe a caregiver of a family member who is suffering, the closer you're there and you stop and you're not in the middle of a task, there's something very sacred and holy about that encounter. It's a small theophany, because you're seeing in the suffering that's there before you, you're seeing an icon of the suffering of Christ, and that's the thing that unfortunately I think gets lost sometimes. Right. In the hustle and bustle of we were talking about the medical industrial complex. I mean, this elaborate system that produces extraordinary kinds of treatments, which can be very helpful, and I don't want to denigrate those at all. But at the same time, the person who is suffering sometimes gets lost for the disease that wants to, that's demanding treatment.
Right. I think it's, too, just to kind of build on what you're sharing, is I think it's so important for us to realize that, so much of what we read in the Church Fathers, you mentioned St. Ignatius of Antioch, but, even with St. Paul's writings, I mean, we hear about this suffering, and in fact, this embracing of it. And, I know that we talked about this earlier, but maybe talk a little bit with our listeners about how so much of what Christianity that we're hearing today in Christianity is, or in some realms of Christianity, is that tend to kind of avoid the suffering, like, and we even have sayings like, why do bad things happen to good people? As if, we shouldn't expect that. So maybe talk a little bit about that with our listeners.
No, I think the corollary to that question you asked is why wouldn't they happen to good people?
Right.
They happen to Christ. I mean, they happen to the God man. I mean, this is why he came to. Yeah, I mean, the interesting, just as a sidebar, the in the Nicene Creed, it doesn't say he died. He said he suffered and was buried. The suffering is inextricably linked to death, and so that's one aspect of this. But let me remind me again what you specifically where you wanted me to go with.
I mean, I just think that I guess for me, it's more of a comment that I just think that for a lot of us, especially in the West, where in many ways we've been kind of sheltered from suffering. We obviously will see suffering in our within our families and maybe even as individuals, but for large parts of the world, suffering is something that they see all the time. I mean, I'm thinking about what's going on in the Gaza Strip right now, and the tremendous amount of suffering that people are witnessing, and then in areas where there's been where war has taken place on their land, and we've been very fortunate in this country not to see that. But let's just talk. Let's kind of build on this a little bit, Dr. Hinshaw. I mean, how is suffering distinguished from pain?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Even lawyers make that distinction when they're speaking in the courtroom. They'll often say, "My client's pain and suffering." So they make a distinction there, and the pain is usually referring to physical pain, physical distress. So that's what we usually think of. And if you go to the hospital and they ask you, "What's your pain?" on a scale of 0, no pain at all, to 10, which is the worst pain you can imagine, they're really talking about the intensity of the pain. Is it sharp, dull, aching, whatever it is? But there's another aspect to pain. Just to talk about the physical pain for a moment, and that is what's called the affective component. And in the research literature related to pain, it's often described on a scale of unpleasantness. So from 0 to 10, how unpleasant is this pain?
Right.
And unpleasantness implies there's something you're reflecting about, that there's a meaning underlying the pain. And that is where you're getting much closer to suffering. So I give you an example. For let's say there's a young woman who it's her first baby. She's in the labor and delivery suite, and she's having 10 over 10 screaming pain. I mean, this is she's never been through labor before. This is, but she holds on to the concept, I'm going to be holding a healthy baby in my arms in a few minutes. And that's what's sustaining her through this really screamingly intensive pain. But if the obstetrician comes in and has kind of a furrowed brow and is anxious, they've been measuring signs of potential distress in the baby, and they're saying, well, we might have to do an emergency operation to deliver the baby. We're worried about the baby's health. Her pain can then suddenly take on a very different, not just the intensity still there, but there's this horrific, what is the meaning of my pain? Am I going to lose my child? Could I die? And so the meaning of the pain comes much closer to this concept of suffering. And so some of the secular definitions of suffering include this concept of a threat to the the threat to the integrity of the person. And if the threat persists, then the suffering continues, as the threat seems to resolve for whatever reason, maybe the person's getting better, then the suffering may dissipate. I would just say that I think that's a wonderful definition for conscious suffering, but I think that suffering from an Orthodox, I'm going to use a philosophical term, but for the Orthodox, I think suffering is ontological. It is something that is in nature, by nature we suffer. We're suffering creatures. And this comes back to the Greek word that is translated suffering, pathos. So pathos can mean suffering, but it also refers to the passions, and the whether it's gluttony, lust, anger, vainglory, pride, and so on. The passions are distortions of inherent qualities that we have, that at least some of the fathers, especially St. Maximus, for example, suggest are nudges coming from God, trying to push us toward God. And when after the fall, they tend to be things that push us away from God. So we either are moving closer to God or we're moving away from Him. Right. And so that experience of the passions, that being caught up in a passion or passions, is at root a significant part of this issue of suffering. It's a distortion of who we are as persons. It's a part of the condition of our mortality, and it will kill us. I mean, this is. But the extraordinary thing is that in the Incarnation, and we're coming up to the great feast of the Incarnation, God became man so that man could become divine. The famous dictum from St. Athanasius. And in that transformation, He comes and He takes on our suffering without sin Himself, but He experiences fully our suffering to transform it, to transfigure it. And I think coming out of the Western understanding of Christendom, all of these things have been sort of thought of as, at best, metaphors, as interesting concepts. Right. But for Orthodox Christians, the metaphors are real. So the suffering, to the extent that any individual suffering is an icon of Christ's suffering, it's a sacred thing. It's a hard saying, I guess, to say this, and I'm not saying that we seek out suffering, but suffering comes to us. It's part of our nature. Or we can have even if we're not suffering ourselves, to whatever extent we can co-suffer with others, this is part of our journey of taking up our cross and following Christ.
I love what you're sharing. I just want to remind our listeners, we are speaking with Dr. Daniel Hinshaw. He is a surgeon and professor emeritus from the University of Michigan. He's written several books that are all on this, generally around this topic that we've been talking about tonight of suffering and how we all experience that. I know it's that time of the year where we for many of us, we're celebrating Christmas and we're getting ready for this, holiday and that great famous Christmas carol of "There's no," this is the best time of the year. But for many people, they are suffering. This time of the year actually becomes a very difficult time for a lot of families who have people that are, or family members that are in hospitals or who may be towards the end of the life. And so we want to dedicate a show to really just pain and suffering, understanding that we're going to experience that. We'd invite you, if you have a question or a comment for Dr. Hinshaw, to please call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or feel free to email me a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. Dr. Hinshaw, I can't help but think, and I'm sure as a surgeon you've seen many of these events, but one of the most humbling and I would argue even sacred events that I've experienced as a priest is being and journeying with people that are suffering. I know that I'm sure we'll talk about this, but, we're not just simply talking about physical suffering, but the emotional suffering, the spiritual suffering that people can endure. Can you talk a little bit about these different levels of suffering, or I would say levels, but different categories of suffering, and how we all need to be aware that this is happening to us, even the suffering of our own sin?
Yeah, thank you for that very good question. There's an extraordinary work that was done by an Anglican physician in the 20th century. She was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis. She also was an atheist when she was young and had a profound Christian conversion. And interestingly enough, one of her close friends and spiritual advisors was Metropolitan Anthony Bloom of blessed memory.
Wow.
But this is Cicely Saunders, who founded the kind of first modern hospice, St. Christopher's Hospice in 1967. And when she was working with people, largely people who had cancer and who were dying and suffering with cancer, she would record their conversations. And then she kind of looked at the themes that came out. And she came to this definition of suffering, which I think it really gets to what you're talking about. And she identified essentially at least 4 different dimensions of the person. And I think this is really quite orthodox, of the person who suffers. And so there's just not only the physical, but there's also the psychological, the social, through our relationships. If I'm in pain, everyone else around me is going to suffer something. Right, I'm going to be irritable. I'm going to isolate myself from others. And then ultimately existential or spiritual suffering. So even people who claim to have no religious faith at all, they're still asking these questions, or they're confronted with them. They may deny it, they may run in the opposite direction, but they're going to, somewhere deep inside, they're going to say, why is this happening to me? Is there meaning in my life? Has there ever been meaning in my life? These are all spiritual questions. And of course, the great religions have to come, they really can be judged on how well they answer these questions, about which all revolve around the question of suffering. But I think when you think about the physical, the psychological, and the social, wherever any of those, 2 of the 3 overlap, you scratch a little bit deeper, there's a spiritual element there. And so I think that's one useful way to think about it. And so a lot of things where we make an assumption that we're looking at it on a very thin, concrete level, we may be ignoring something really deeper that's going on. And even those sort of concrete questions always have some other potentially deeper aspect to it. Right. In terms of, for example, just I remember in teaching medical students and residents and other health professionals, when you're at the bedside of someone who has just died, even though they had, I didn't try to get into a theological discussion with them, but I just said, and because there are a lot of grieving family members, I said, don't treat them as a corpse. The person's still there. Now, from an Orthodox standpoint, of course, we're thinking the traditional Jewish understanding of the soul hovering near the body and that there's soul separation. That's why Lazarus wasn't raised until the fourth day. So, but I think when I've taught that to people who may not have any particular religious grounding, it makes sense to them, because there's just something, a violation if you suddenly go in and well, they're not breathing anymore, their heart's not functioning, they're not there, but that's part of that comes from distortions that have come out of the transplant world, where we've accommodated to a brain death definition to indicate that somebody is dead, so their organs could be donated. Now, Orthodox ethicists will debate about this, but I think the general teaching, especially from Metropolitan Nikolaos, who's the head of the Greek Orthodox bioethics committee, is that sort of love and altruism, in some sense, trump that. The person is dying, right. And when they meet these criteria, they're giving the gift of life to another person, but of course it's also they're giving part of themselves. I mean, so that there is a chimeric person there. So this suffering, wherever it will lead, that's the most dramatic example, but it's a shared suffering. And in a world where we've been atomized and individualized and hyper-individualized through media, unfortunately, we forget the fact that as suffering creatures, our suffering is really meant to be, in some sense, born together. To carry it together. I think. I mean, this is what Christ says. Take up your cross and follow me. Right.
Well, and then and how when St. Paul says, carry each other's burdens in this way, you fulfill the will of Christ. I mean, I think there's something, I know when my father was diagnosed with cancer, that there was such a tremendous, early on shock and just an emotional suffering with that, because as a clergyman, you typically try not to show your emotions. You try to kind of stay, even keel, but it was very difficult because there was a lot of suffering on the inside. And then as I kind of, grew through this process, and through his suffering, there was a great beauty in watching his genuine desire to come closer to Christ through his suffering brought me with him. And I've oftentimes told my congregation here in Jacksonville that I'm a better priest because I walked through that suffering with my father in ways that I don't think that I would have never been able to do had I not gone through that with him. So I do think there's something sacred. It's difficult, obviously, to watch people suffer. It's difficult and challenging for us to do that. But there is something beautiful that's associated with it. I just kind of want to build, kind of continuing the conversation. What is our church's understanding of the person who is actually suffering?
I think that in a sense, each human being, I alluded to it earlier, but I think each human being who is created in the image and unto the likeness of Christ, that we're called to engage in this process of deification, of theosis, of coming closer and closer to God, that suffering is an integral part of that journey, and maybe it's not our own physical suffering or our own psychological suffering, but it is this participation as you experienced with your father. I mean, I find, just getting back to what you said about your father's journey, I find it very comforting that Jesus, knowing full well that he was going to raise Lazarus, stood at the tomb, and the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. I mean, he still wept, and because he was weeping at this whole state of broken humanity, that he came to transform that. I mean. So I think from Orthodox, suffering isn't eliminated. It's not a. And this isn't fair to Buddhists, but I mean, it isn't a denial of or a negation of suffering. It is a transformation of it. So it's there, but it now becomes the vehicle to become like St. Ignatius said, to be with Christ. And I think there's so much of.
Would you say though, Dr. Hinshaw? Would you say that obviously that statement I would imagine is to those who take that, because I think sometimes through suffering there are people that actually withdraw from God and blame God for their suffering, and then as a result sometimes even the family members who see their family members suffering say, how would God do something like this or allow this to happen? This person was such a good person. Why would they, so I guess it really comes down to the choices that we make while we're in that season of suffering.
That and I think you make a really good, essential point here is that this isn't the time, when somebody is deeply suffering, those questions are absolutely legitimate. I think that's first of all, within the Judeo-Christian tradition, going back to the book of Job, Job questioned. These are things that the only answer that God could give to that would be Jesus on the cross. But that's not something that's going to comfort somebody who's in the middle of absolute distress. And again, just to make a reference to Metropolitan Nicolaus, who I have a great respect for. He founded the first the first hospice of any kind in Athens, in Greece. He's a wonderful man. But he made a comment once, and I can only echo this because this is my experience too, is you can't sit and give people sermons about the theodicy or why is there suffering in the world and all this sort of, when they're grieving or when they're in great pain. All you can do is hold their hand and weep with them, because it is a horrible thing. It's a tragedy. And you mentioned what's going on in Gaza. Of course, all of this gets politicized, but the thing that strikes me about so much of my own medical training and the sort of Western thinking that we all are, marinated in all the time, is that our job is to figure out a way to fix it. And ultimately, we can't fix much of this stuff, but we can pray. And it's taking me, into my late 60s as an Orthodox Christian to begin to realize there's really something there. It's not just sort of nice thoughts or some kind of Hallmark card experience, of wishing, wishful thinking. It's struggling, with the most basic prayer that we say all the time in the liturgy, Lord have mercy, and applying it to, thinking of these circumstances. Clearly the monks on Mount Athos, the monastics, the monastic tradition in the church has always been that the world would have been destroyed long ago if there weren't monastics praying day and night. And we say it, almost sort of in a trite way, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that the only way I can sometimes address or help people is through this means. And it's not some minimal thing. It's the first and most appropriate thing. And it's tied directly to the rest of the sacramental life of the church. So many, unfortunately, even faithful Christians, they go to the doctor, they get all, do everything you can, and then the doctor says, well, I'm sorry, I've done everything I can, I can't help you anymore. And of course, that's terrible. It's sort of a sense of abandonment. And then they run to the church and say, well, what can you do? Can you fix it? It should be the other way around, and it should be in fully integrated together. My job as a palliative care physician, I always felt, was to especially address those more superficial layers of the suffering, the physical, where I had some expertise and skills, help them to guide them to the point where they then can pray, because it's the existential, it's the spiritual aspect that is something that the individual themselves, their loved ones, their community have to engage in. It's a, the Orthodox life is a team sport. It's a
Right. There's something truly, as I was mentioning earlier, something so authentic about a person when they're close to death. There's this it's almost like this mask or these layers have been taken off, and it's just them, and there's no phone calls to make, emails to check, and they see, and it's sacred, and I think too, I think for our listeners, I think it's so important that we recognize that, Christ tells us that we should be expecting suffering, kind of going back to this idea that I think, we're so blessed in the Western countries, especially in the United States, where, we look at any type of I'm not sure how, our ability to our suffering tolerance level, if you will, how willing or how able we are to deal with suffering. And I think when it hits us, it really shatters us. It kind of shakes us at our core, because when you have things that are so easily accessible to you, you have medical facilities that are so easily accessible to you for the most part. You have just what we have in this country, unlike what we see around the world. When you hit that experience, when you feel that, it's almost like I'm sure there's studies on this, but just that in countries that have so much wealth, how much they suffer and struggle with suffering when it does impact them in ways that probably countries that deal with suffering on a much more regular basis, if you will, not only internally but externally, may have better tools to deal with that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think part of the problem, and I don't want to get into a political theory, but I'll just say this much, that in the West, because I grew up as a Western Christian, I think there was a big confusion coming out of the Enlightenment, or so-called Enlightenment period, and the Industrial Revolution, where prosperity, so especially sort of in a Calvinist kind of thinking, that your state is sort of defined at the beginning. The God is sort of extreme Augustinian kind of view, and if you are prosperous, that's a proof positive that you're saved. And rather than being saved is participating in the divine life. That's a completely saved is like, okay, you get rewarded, and it's this reward system. It's almost a transaction with God,
right?
And unfortunately, the most extreme examples of this are the prosperity gospel. But all of this is present in various iterations on a sliding scale, unfortunately. And our whole, when Christ said that the kingdom of heaven is within you, if the kingdom of heaven is within us, what does that mean? They talk about for example, in the sense of the Hezekiah tradition of the silence, the stillness, that your mind is in your heart. So the heart is the center of the person. And obviously the heart must be an extraordinarily a whole universe. And this is something that Father Roman Braga spoke about. He came to an understanding of this after being in solitary confinement for several months as a prisoner of conscience, where there was no place to go. He had been an academic. He was a graduate student studying spirituality under Father Dimitru Staniloae when he was arrested the first time. He went through intensive interrogations and torture and so on. But he said, you either go crazy or you have to go inside. And if we go inside, we should be meeting, the Holy Trinity, the Mother of God, all the saints, all of those people who've gone before. And how do we do that? I mean, how do we? And when we're at the bedside of someone suffering, or maybe who is dying, or who has just died, the veil sort of falls down a little bit. This is remember the temple was the curtain was rent, when Christ died. But I mean, for each of us, in a certain sense, we are meant to be like little Christs, and I wonder if that isn't an opportunity for us, that we're frightened of it. It's a sort of terrifying prospect, I suppose, in one sense. But I must say that there have been many times when I've been with dying people where I've seen extraordinary things. I can't give you any kind of scientific explanation for what I saw, but clearly there were encounters across some kind of a veil, into the next life, and and sometimes they would be able to talk about it. They'd say, well, I was talking to my parents who were, they were saying, come join me. Or my own father, when he died a few years ago, I was blessed to be with him, and he had the last day of his life, he was developing a fever and a very rapid breathing and so on, and was not responding. But at the moment of death, he stopped breathing, and this man who had some mild cognitive changes, his eyes opened. He was looking up at the ceiling so intently. It was the old father that I knew from years before, who was very sharp, a very intelligent physician, and he was listening, some kind of instruction, and it happened in a matter of several seconds. He closed his eyes, and it was a peace. And I would just say also that the face, you've probably seen this, when somebody who has been suffering, and when they die, the facial muscles relax. There is this sense of they've entered another state. I mean, obviously, they may be facing that first judgment, but at the same time, they're not abandoned. I mean, I think the Mother of God is there with them. The saints, their guardian angel, and it's incredibly comforting. I don't know if you've seen this, but our monastery on Thanksgiving every year recites an akathist of thanksgiving to God for all things, and it was written by a prisoner in the Soviet Gulag, an Orthodox prisoner in the Gulag, and one of the Kentuckian in the speaks specifically of this, and he's obviously talking about other prisoners he'd seen dying, and thanking God for this joy, sort of transition from their intense suffering to this peace and joy in a really awful circumstances. So it sort of takes your breath away how someone could be that grateful, even under such duress. And
I love that. Let me share with our listeners, if you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Dr. Daniel Hinshaw. We're talking about pain and suffering, and really how to understand it, and what it means in our own Christian walk of faith. If you have a question for Dr. Daniel, we'd love to hear from you. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or email me during the live broadcast of our show by emailing me at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. So I have a couple questions. So this is the question that just came in through the email. It says, how do you explain to children and adolescents that suffering brings us closer to God, and God's goal for us is not always the absence of suffering? How do you explain that?
I think you, oftentimes when I'm asked a question, I will turn right around and ask a question back. And I'll say, well, what do you think? What do you think suffering is? So to try to get an understanding of what they're specifically talking about, because they may have it on, depending on their developmental level and so forth. They may be children who are probably 6 to 8 years old, or certainly have seen dead animals. They may have witnessed roadkill, or other kind of tragic things that happen to the animal world, or they may have seen a loved one or a grandparent die, or be aware of it, or have attended a funeral. So they can certainly understand in some concrete way, death. But the language has to be very straightforward. You can't tell them, well, grandma's gone. Particularly a younger child, you can't tell them, grandma's gone to be with Jesus. Well, you might get the answer, well, when's she coming back? And so I think you have to be direct and clear about it, but I'll have to use examples that they've seen, in their own life. And but with respect to the suffering, I think that children understand more intuitively than we think. I mean, I in my travels and teaching abroad, and where I've seen, worked with children's hospices and so on, I'll tell you one story that just really was heartbreaking, but not uncommon. And that is because parents are so protective. They want to protect their child, and they want to save them no matter what. There was one instance where this was in Romania, where a child who was probably about 10 years old, and his mother would not let him talk. He multiple times he tried to bring up. He knew that his cancer was progressing. He knew that he was declining, and one evening he had a dream and it was a very vivid dream. It was his guardian angel coming and telling him that he was going to be taking him soon, to be with God. And he was he woke up overjoyed. I mean, he was just so relieved and at peace. And he tried to start to tell his mother this. And she said, no, I don't want to hear about, you're going to be fine. You're going to get, and it was just very distressing to him. So that actually the hospice nurse who related it in the meeting was, we're trying to work out a way. How do you help the parent come to grips with something that the child already understands? And because of their, I don't know, it's the nature of the purity of the child. They're simpler. They're not so complicated like old people are. The longer we live, we get complicated by all of these ideas about denying death and so on. They see it. I mean, but I think it's helpful to start with what do you see, and what are your experiences, and walk with them as they describe it, and don't assume anything. Don't assume, but at the same time, don't try to deny something when they're actually saying, look, I want to, because he was wanting to prepare his mother. He said, I'm ready. I'm ready to go. I'm at peace, and I want you to be at peace.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I think it's one of those things too, for the emailer. I would just add a little bit to what Dr. Hinshaw had mentioned. And I think which I think he's absolutely correct in doing, is not only asking them, but also utilizing some of the examples that they've experienced. I mean, when you fall off a bike, that suffering, who do you tend to go to? You don't simply stay in that suffering. You kind of draws you closer to God, and or closer to your parents. You tend to want to go to tell your parent what happened, and there's a connection there, and perhaps using that kind of an analogy of the fact of when we fall and when we hurt, we tend to go call mom or call dad to help. Well, in that suffering as well, when we go through that in life, it reminds us that we need God. But I do think that, I think it's, the emailer, gives a follow-up question I think is also very important. The question was, could you please then speak on the role of hospice care in the end of life from an Orthodox perspective? Let's talk about that, yeah.
So just to briefly summarize, the United States has a fairly generous Medicare hospice benefit. And basically when a person is diagnosed to have an illness that is likely to take their life within 6 months, or sometimes physicians use what's called the would you be surprised question. Would you be surprised if this person might be dead within a year? That would, so it needs to be generous because the benefit itself is very helpful. It provides a variety of sometimes sophisticated but personal care in the home to the person who is ill and also to their family. So everything from an aide to come bathe them, to some elements of physical therapy, rehab to keep them strong as long as they can be active or want to be active, to good pain and symptom control from the physician and nurses that are involved. And this service can be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on call. If a person has a crisis where their symptoms are too difficult to manage at home, they can be admitted briefly in like an inpatient hospice unit or in a specialized unit in a hospital that's dedicated to that. From an Orthodox perspective, I again just would emphasize that hospice role is to smooth the way so that the relationship of that person to the sacramental life of the church can be deepened. Because if I'm in pain, if I'm nauseated and vomiting continuously, or I'm coughing all the time, or there's chaos around me, I can't pray. And I've sometimes I've actually worked with patients specifically who even, basically said, make me comfortable so I can pray. And that to me, that is I feel like I've done something really worthwhile if I can help them get to that point. Now, obviously, I've sometimes made people more comfortable, and then they say, well, I just feel better. I'm not going to die now. And so what they're missing is the opportunity to confront their death and to use their death, to as a transformative act to remember,
Right.
Remembering our death is essentially remembering our mortality, remembering that we will be standing before Christ, who is judge, but he's also, his mercy outweighs his justice always. I mean,
Dr. Hinshaw, what you're sharing is so prevalent in the Orthodox Church Fathers. And we've heard, maybe talk a little bit about, why were the Church Fathers so emphatic about reminding us to think upon, our own death on a daily basis?
I think, it's one of the tools of the spiritual warfare, I guess you could say. But it's a reminder, first of all, that for much of the church's history, life was a gift every day. I mean, it is for you and me, but we sometimes take it more for granted because we have an elaborate health system that does keep most of us alive a lot longer than the expected lifespan, say, of 100 years ago. But if the expected lifespan of people in the in late antiquity was not very long, 30, 40 years probably for a lot of people. I mean, it's extraordinary, for example, that St. Anthony the Great lived over 100 years of age, but he was out in the desert, he was by himself, he had the fasting. There's good evidence that fasting actually prolongs life. I mean, he did the experiment himself. There's acts today supporting that. So his was, of course, a challenging life to try to emulate, but I think the idea of remembering our death is not as a means of being negative or despairing. It's to keep us focused. How many times I'm saying for about myself now, when I go to liturgy, how many times is my mind wandering? And to keep oneself focused, and praying continually. The remembrance of death is one of those very powerful reminders of it, because we will encounter God face to face when we die, and there's a wonderful quote I heard you, Father Lau, make on one of your earlier shows. I'm going to paraphrase it here, but I said we may not be in the end times, but we may indeed be in or near the end of our time. And that's a very useful thing to remember. So people think about, well, gosh, there's a lot of apocalyptic things going on right now, but in every generation since the apostles, that's been true, actually. I personally think that they're even worse now, but right, what am I? Who am I to make that final judgment? Obviously, that's up to God and in His providence. But I think that the fact that I could die tonight, and I'm aware of that, means that the moments that I have right now, the time I'm spending with you in this conversation, need to count for something. I hope and pray that I use my time well, and so it should help us reflect on how we use our time, how we this is the whole idea of a fasting period in the church, is to actually not just fast for food, but it's fasting in terms of slowing down and thinking carefully about how we use time, because time is an issue only for creatures.
Right.
It's not, God lives outside time. So
right.
this is our, I hope that helps answer part of that.
Yeah, I love that. We just have about 5 minutes left of our show, but I do want to get to this theological term of kenosis. How is this helpful for understanding well, let's first talk about that term. For many of our listeners, they may not be familiar with that term, but also to kind of build on that is how is kenosis helpful for understanding the process of suffering as it plays out in the lives of human beings, communities, and the cosmos?
So, the place where kenosis comes into the scriptures most prominently is in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians in the 2nd chapter. I think it's in verse 8 where he speaks about Christ emptying himself. Mm-hmm. And in classical Greek, the ekenose, kenosis could be even emptying your bowels. I mean, it's a very earthy kind of word, but he turns it, and that's an appropriate thing to think of because it's essentially saying that we worship an extremely humble God. God, in his humility to reach his fallen creature, will go to the lowest level to help us. And the point I'm trying to make, I guess, about kenosis is that Christ voluntarily did it. He voluntarily entered into our state, into our human, limited, time-bound condition of mortality to transform death, to basically destroy death as we know it, to transform it into a means toward life, eternal life. But kenosis for us in our mortal condition is, in a sense, every loss we experience is a reminder to remember death. So the losses we have, whether it's a loved one, whether it's a marriage that fails, whether we lose a spouse, whether our children grow up and move away, whether we lose a job, whether we have some major illness, all of these things, all of these major bumps in life, and some people are born with behind the, they already. I mean, the poor children who were born in Gaza, they were already had a head start on the kenotic journey, so to speak, and now they're experiencing horrific kind of kenotic experience now. So you could think of kenosis in that sense, this involuntary kenosis that's happening to each of us in different circumstances, as sort of the choreographer of our suffering. It's how the suffering plays out in individual lives. But there's an element of this that's Christ-like, and that is we can look at that and we can engage with it, and we can voluntarily take on that kenosis. We can work with it. It's how do we I think Father Alexander Schmemann once made the comment that we don't have any control over the cards that we're dealt with in the game of life, but how we play the cards, that's up to us. And so I think in that sense, it's not that we need to, in some morbid way, engage, celebrate our suffering, but at the same time, like Saint Ignatius, we can say, but I can come close to Christ. And I think in our prayer life, if we say, Lord, transform this pain, transform this suffering into something holy, He will. I think that. And if we feel like we don't really believe that, then be honest about it and say, Lord, help me to believe it. I mean, I think these are sort of simple prayers, but it's taken me, almost 7 decades to come to realization that it's not about intellectual games anymore. This is the real Christian life is simple.
This is for real.
Simple. It's simple and it's childlike, and that's why the children are closer to it.
I think first of all, I'm just so grateful that you joined us this evening, Dr. Hinshaw. And I know that your schedule is very busy. I do want to, just before the time is over, I do want to encourage our listeners. Any of these books are outstanding. So let me just remind you of the books that Dr. Hinshaw has authored. There's Suffering in the Nature of Healing, that was published in 2013. Touch in the Healing of the World, in 2017 was published, and then Thriving in the Face of Mortality, Kenosis in the Mystery of Life, which was just published, and in a historical novel, also Neither Bond Nor Free, in 2019. And then his newest book, which should be coming out shortly, is called Journey to Simplicity, The Life and Wisdom of Archimandrite Roman Braga, which will be published through St. Vladimir's Press. I just want to thank you again for being here. I think one of the things that we have hopefully enlightened our listeners with is just the fact that, that suffering, that in our life, we're either coming into a suffering season, we're coming out of a suffering season, or we're in a suffering season. And remember that Christ is with us in that suffering. We don't worship a Christ who is watching us from a distance. I mean, I think that, and I'm sure you would agree with this, Dr. Hinshaw, is just, reminding ourselves of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, this suffering, this falling down and suffering and pain. We see him on the cross in these, and him, uttering words that sometimes we may even say ourselves. That, my God, why have you forsaken me? That God doesn't leave us, or we're not alone in our suffering. It's the fact that God is with us at every step of the way. And I just would encourage you that if you are someone that is going through a season of suffering, listen to this, encourage them to listen to this show, to read the books that Dr. Hinshaw has authored, and to remind yourself that God is with us. I love this hymn that we sing during Great Lent, where it says, even in times of distress, we have no other help but you. You are the Lord of the powers. Have mercy on us. So we hope that these words have been a source of inspiration and encouragement. Again, Dr. Hinshaw, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to get to know you and to have the opportunity, and I hope that you'll come back to our show as well.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a joy to be with you, and Orthodox emphasize a sorrowful joy.
That's right.
And it's okay to be silent and present.
I love that. What a great way to end. Thank you again, Dr. Hinshaw. And thanks to Matushka Trudy for producing tonight's show. She always does an amazing job. Join us next Tuesday for a brand new episode of Live with the Louhs. And again, if you want to receive our daily inspirational messages, go right now to our website at thelouhs.com/subscribe and just simply put in your email address and you'll receive our daily inspirational message. Everyone, God bless you all and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.